The disappearance of an entire Catholic girls' class and their 2 chaperones in 1995 became one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases. 32 students, 2 nuns, and a volunteer driver gone without a trace. The last known sighting was a sun-baked stretch of Highway 85. Tire tracks led into dust and scrub, then vanished. The case stalled there, trapped in silence. No ransom notes, no witnesses, no wreckage. Nothing but 35 missing souls. For 7 years the file sat buried, its pages yellowing, its weight pressing down on detectives who had long since stopped hoping for answers. Parents grew older, candles burned out, vigils dwindled. The desert had swallowed the truth whole. Then, in the spring of 2002, the desert gave something back. At the Nalas port of entry, just north of the Mexican border, a new piece of technology was being tested, a high-resolution cargo X-ray scanner. It was designed to pierce steel walls and expose the human cargo traffickers tried to hide. That morning, an aging charter bus rolled into the bay. Its paint was sun-faded, its windows streaked with dust. The driver's papers checked out, but protocol required every vehicle be scanned. When the image appeared on the monitor, the agents in the booth froze. Through the skeletal rendering of steel frames and vinyl seats, shapes emerged, human forms, dozens of them. The figures were seated in rows, shoulders slumped, heads bowed forward. At first glance, they looked like passengers waiting out an inspection. But something about them was wrong. They were too still, their outlines too stark. The agents adjusted the focus. Details sharpened. Hollow eye sockets, ribs, vertebrae. These were not passengers. These were skeletons. 35 of them, every seat filled, every figure facing forward, as if they had never moved since the day they sat down. Agents stormed the bus, weapons drawn. They found nothing. The seats were empty, the cushions cracked with age. No bodies, no luggage, only dust and silence. But in the seams of the metal floor, investigators discovered something the scanner hadn't shown. Etchings, dozens of them, carved by hand, desperate and shallow. Initials, prayers, please. One scratch message read, "We are still here." The bus was seized. The driver was detained, but the name on his license didn't exist in any database. Within a day, he vanished from custody. No transfer papers. No explanation. Forensics confirmed traces of human DNA under the seats, some matching the missing girls. But other samples, male unidentified, complicated the picture. The discovery should have closed the case. Instead, it shattered it open. The X-ray image became legend inside the agency, passed between officers in grainy photocopies, whispered about in briefing rooms. Some called it a glitch. Others swore it was proof that the missing girls had been there, crammed into a hidden compartment, held against their will long after the world stopped searching. The story of the St. Cecilia's girls wasn't a cold case. It was an ongoing crime, and what the bus revealed in 2002 was only the beginning. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next twists in this chilling case. Every chapter pulls you deeper into the mystery, and what comes next will change everything you think you know about the 1995 disappearance. May 12, 1995. The desert sky above St. Cecilia's Academy was a clean, merciless blue. Morning sunlight bounced off the convent's pale walls and the metal of a yellow school bus idling in the lot. Parents stood in clusters, waving, squinting against the glare, clutching coffee cups as they called out reminders and goodbyes. It should have been an ordinary Friday, a simple field trip, nothing more. 32 girls between the ages of 12 and 14 packed in the bus. Plaid skirts swishing, white blouses stiff with starch, chatter rising like a flock of birds. Their voices filled the morning, songs, laughter, the click of disposable cameras. Whispered secrets traded in the back rows. 2 nuns supervised the trip. Sister Ruth Gentle, known for sneaking peppermints into her students' palms during long masses. And Sister Magdalena, sharp-eyed, strict, whose homilies about purity and sacrifice unsettled even the parents. The balance between them seemed deliberate, warmth to soften the steel. At the wheel was Howard Cole, 46, a volunteer driver from the parish. He was known, if barely, A quiet man who helped with charity deliveries, who sometimes fixed the parish plumbing, who never spoke more than was necessary. Parents trusted him enough, or told themselves they did. The trip was routine. The bus would travel south on Highway 85 to visit the San Miguel Mission, a centuries-old adobe church just past the state line. The girls had been studying missionary history, and the visit was meant to close the lesson. They would tour the grounds, sing hymns, picnic under the mesquite trees, and return by evening in time for supper. The bus pulled out at 9:12 a.m. Some parents waved until it disappeared around the bend. Others left quickly, already thinking of errands. None imagined it would be the last time they saw their daughters. The girls filled the bus with life. One section harmonized them. The front rows trying to drown them out with pop songs from the radio. A pair of best friends scribbled notes back and forth, folding them into shapes before passing them down the aisle. In the back, the athletes rehearsed cheers for the upcoming spring games, clapping out rhythms against the windows. Magdalena sat stiffly near the front, rosary wound around her hand, lips moving in silent prayer. Ruth sat farther back, chatting with the girls, laughing at their jokes, her presence a gentle buffer against the strictness of her colleague. The desert rolled past the windows. Endless sand, thorny scrub, the occasional rust-red butte. Out there, the horizon looked infinite, as if the world had no end. No one noticed when the radio cut to static. Howard fiddled with the dial, frowning, but left it. The girls were making their own noise anyway. No one thought much of the Dieter sign either. A portion of Highway 85 was closed for maintenance, forcing traffic onto an older, less traveled route that curved deeper into the desert before rejoining the main road. The detour was longer, but not unusual. At the last gas station before the detour, the clerk noticed them, a yellow school bus, windows crowded with girls' faces, rolling past without stopping. He remembered it because it was strange. Every school trip he'd ever seen had pulled in for sodas or bathrooms. This one didn't. The driver kept going. Back at St. Cecilia's, time ticked on. The field trip should have ended by 6:30 p.m. Parents waited in the lot. Some with cameras, others with toddlers tugging at their sleeves. The parking space where the bus should have pulled in remained empty. By 7 o'clock, murmurs turned to questions. Had they broken down? Lost track of time? By 8 o'clock, parents were making phone calls, dialing the parish office, the police station, anyone who might have heard. By 9 o'clock, panic had set in. Detectives were dispatched. Highway patrol cars swept the routes, their headlights slicing across desert brush. Spotter planes flew at dawn, tracing every curve of the highway, every dry arroyo, every stretch of sand wide enough to conceal a vehicle. Not a scrap, not a shard of glass, a skid mark, or a broken branch. It was as if the bus had simply driven into the air and dissolved. In the following days, St. Cecilia's became a shrine. Parents clutched each other in the halls. Photographs of smiling daughters pinned to bulletin boards and chapel doors. Reporters crowded outside. Cameras pointed at tear-streaked faces. Priests offered sermons about faith and endurance, though privately even they admitted confusion. The first Real lead came from that gas station clerk. He insisted he'd seen the bus around 10:30 a.m. heading south. He could describe the faces at the windows, the plaid uniforms. But the security camera was broken. His testimony was all police had. The highway where he'd seen it stretched into desolation. Sparse traffic. Long miles where a vehicle could disappear. Tire tracks were found in one patch of sand near a dry wash, but they ended abruptly, wind wiping away direction. Detectives considered every possibility. A hijacking, a mechanical failure followed by abduction, a mass runaway, though no one believed 32 sheltered Catholic girls could orchestrate such a thing. Cartel activity was whispered, but there were no demands for ransom. Days turned to weeks. The desert heat deepened, scouring away traces, bleaching evidence invisible. The case went cold faster than anyone admitted aloud. The contrast in those left behind became sharp. Some parents clung to ritual, lighting candles every evening, pressing rosaries into their palms until beads left marks. They told themselves the girls were alive, hidden somewhere, waiting to be found. Others grew bitter. They accused the church of secrecy, the police of incompetence, even one another of negligence. They demanded answers, screamed at cameras, pounded their fists on the locked doors of officials who had none to give. The priests counseled patience. Detectives made promises. None were kept. A month later, searchers found the first artifact. It was a school cardigan, maroon, torn along the seam. It lay crumpled in a dry arroyo 30 miles south of the last confirmed sighting. Forensic testing showed no blood, no struggle, just wear. The initials stitched inside belonged to one of the missing girls. The find should have offered hope. Instead, it deepened the dread. If the cardigan was here, where were the rest of them? Years would pass before any new development surfaced. By 1996, the case was already fading from headlines. By 1997, new tragedies pushed it to the back of memory. But for the families, the silence was unbearable. Every birthday passed uncelebrated. Every Christmas dinner a reminder of an empty chair. The question grew louder in absence. How does an entire bus vanish? The answer, or the first glimpse of it, would not arrive until 7 years later, when a cargo X-ray machine revealed an image that would rewrite the case entirely. But in 1995, all anyone knew was this. The bus left at 9:12 a.m. It never came back, and whatever happened between those points had been carried off by the desert, hidden in its silence, waiting to return on someone else's terms. The first phone calls went out just after sundown. At first, they sounded almost mundane. A late bus, a missed schedule, a school trip delayed on the road. Parents gathered in the church parking lot in Nogales with folded arms and nervous smiles, convincing themselves the convoy had probably stopped for food or that the driver had pulled over to handle an overheated engine. But by midnight, the laughter was gone. The bus hadn't arrived. Calls to nearby motels turned up nothing. A highway patrol officer drove the lonely stretch of State Route 82, his cruiser headlights sweeping across empty asphalt and desert scrub. No bus, no skid marks, no debris, no answers. The panic set in quickly. The missing weren't drifters, weren't adults who might have chosen to vanish. They were children. 32 Catholic schoolgirls in plaid skirts, and one young nun who served as their chaperone. By dawn, their absence had become a crisis. Mothers clutched rosaries. Fathers barked into payphones. The parish priest offered prayer that sounded less like faith and more like desperation. The media swarmed in. Television anchors framed it in breathless tones. An entire class of girls simply gone. Reporters lingered at the school gate, shoving microphones into the faces of parents too broken to speak. The first line of suspicion was simple. The bus must have broken down. Perhaps the driver had taken a back road. Perhaps an accident had occurred somewhere remote. State police and volunteers scoured miles of desert, low-flying helicopters tracing the arid land with infrared cameras. Nothing. Not a tire track. Not a scrap of metal. Not a footprint. How could a school bus, bright yellow, impossible to miss, disappear as though it had never existed? Investigators quickly turned their attention to the driver. A man in his 50s, unremarkable, a long-time employee for the diocese's transport fleet. His record showed nothing unusual. No debts, no criminal record, no links to anyone who might want to abduct dozens of children in a single stroke. And yet, suspicions whispered. Could he have betrayed them? Could one man have lured 32 girls off the road into silence? Then came the sightings. One motorist claimed he'd seen the bus just outside Patagonia, Arizona, heading toward the border hours after she'd have been home. Another insisted he'd passed a vehicle full of uniformed girls near Sonoita, though he couldn't swear it was the same group. Each tip was followed with intensity, each one collapsing into nothing. Days turned to weeks. Posters lined storefront windows, black and white photocopies of smiling faces, each captioned with missing. Tips trickled in, then dried up. Desert nights grew colder. Parents stopped sleeping. Detectives began to say the unthinkable out loud. Maybe the bus had crossed the border. But if so, why? And how? A Mexican cartel kidnapping 33 people in one sweep seemed implausible. Smuggling rings dealt in individuals or small groups, not entire classrooms. And yet the location, Nogales, a border town, fed every rumor, every speculation. Could the girls have been trafficked? Sold? The official narrative clung to hope. Police insisted they would find the missing class. But behind closed doors, officers admitted the case was collapsing. They had no bus, no witnesses who could be pinned down, no ransom calls, no bodies, only silence. By the end of the summer, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. FBI analysts reviewed traffic cameras, blurry, inconclusive. Border Patrol checkpoints logged nothing. A few tire impressions near a rest stop turned out to belong to a delivery truck. What remained was a chilling void. Families pleaded for answers. Reporters moved on. The parish school fell silent. 32 empty desks a daily wound. And somewhere behind sealed evidence lockers, a case file grew thick with dead-end leads. For 7 years, it sat there, gathering dust, waiting until 2002, when a border X-ray machine lit up with ghostly silhouettes that looked like the girls had never left. And what the X-ray revealed would unravel everything investigators thought they knew about that deserted highway night. It was a routine night at the Nogales port of entry in May of 2002. Cargo trucks rumbled in, engines growling, drivers tapping ash into the desert wind as they waited their turn. Customs officers leaned against steel railings, trading small talk, watching the clock tick toward midnight. Then came the truck, a faded blue semi, plates half obscured with road dust, its driver sweating beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. On the surface, nothing unusual, another load of produce, declared as melons. But the X-ray machine had just been installed that month, a towering contraption, its scanning arms moving slowly across trailers like the eye of some unblinking god. When the blue semi rolled forward, the operator sat up straight. The first pass was static. Lines and shapes, boxes, crates, a geometry of cargo. Then shadows shifted, and something else began to form. Figures. At first, the operator thought it was a trick. Overlapping crates, a distortion in the scan. But the silhouettes were too clear, too human. Small heads, thin shoulders, knees drawn to chests. Children. He blinked, heart pounding, leaned closer to the screen. There were not one or two, but many rows of ghost-like outlines, huddled together in a hidden compartment carved into the trailer's frame. And then the coldest realization of all, the way they were grouped, pressed shoulder to shoulder, looked less like passengers and more like captives. The officer slammed the alert button. Within seconds, supervisors crowded the monitor, their faces blanching. Radios erupted. The truck was diverted into secondary inspection, armed agents closing in, weapons drawn. The driver panicked, bolting from the cab. He didn't get far. When they cracked open a concealed chamber, a wave of heat and stench rolled out. Inside, packed tighter than anyone thought possible, were 33 figures. Girls, young women, their faces pale, eyes wide, mouths gagged. Alive. The room fell into stunned silence. Agents pulled them out one by one, laying them in the open air. Paramedics rushed in. Oxygen masks pressed to faces. For bags hung from hooks. The voices of children, raspy, disoriented, filled the night. For 7 years, the official story had been, they've vanished without a trace. And now, suddenly, impossibly, here they were, huddled in a steel box, less than a mile from border. But relief twisted quickly into something darker, because the girls were no longer children. 7 years had passed. The uniforms were gone, replaced by rags. Their hair had been shorn and grown again. Their eyes, once bright in school portraits, now carried a hollow, haunted glaze. And when investigators tried to speak with them, when they begged to know where they had been all these years, the girls gave almost nothing back. Some refused to speak at all. Others whispered fragments, names that meant nothing, places no one could locate, routines that sounded like indoctrination. It was survival, but it was also something else. Conditioning. These weren't just missing girls. They were survivors of something organized, something relentless, something that had hidden them in plain sight for nearly a decade. Questions spiraled immediately. Had the Catholic girls' class been trafficked from day one? Was the bus simply a cover for a larger operation? If they had been moved across state lines, across borders. How many times had they passed checkpoints unseen? And the most damning question of all, who had the power to keep 33 children invisible for 7 years? The case that once seemed dead was now wide open and far more horrifying, because the rescue at Nogales didn't end the crime. It was only the beginning of the revelations. And in the days that followed, investigators would uncover something in the driver's abandoned notebook that pointed not to Mexico, but back to Arizona, to the very desert highway where it all began. They had been missing for 7 years, but the silence of those first hours after rescue was deafening. Inside a makeshift medical tent at the Nogales port, federal agents, nurses, and trauma specialists swirled around the survivors. The girls, now young women, aged 16 to 20, sat on cots wrapped in blankets, for lines dripping into their veins. Their faces were gray with exhaustion, lips cracked, bodies trembling as though the desert night could never warm them. But it was their eyes that unsettled everyone most. Wide, glassy, unblinking. The eyes of people who had seen too much and learned that words could cost them everything. Investigators tried gently at first. They didn't want to overwhelm them, not after what they'd endured. Questions came slowly in careful voices. Where have you been kept? Do you know who took you? Can you remember the last thing before the bus disappeared? For a long while, there were no answers, just the sound of medical equipment humming, of pens scratching on clipboards, of agents shifting uncomfortably in folding chairs. And then, finally, one of the girls whispered. It was barely audible, a single word. Rooms. The interrogator leaned closer. Rooms? What kind of rooms? But she closed her eyes, shutting herself away. Another spoke later, her voice brittle. We weren't supposed to look outside. The fragments came like that. A trickle of phrases, some repeated, others cut off by sudden silence. Lights never off. Food in trays. We prayed, but they told us, don't say names. Never names. The notes piled up, confusing and incomplete. Whatever story the girls carried was fractured, deliberately fractured. It was as if someone had trained them to never tell the whole truth, to fracture memory into pieces that could never form a picture. And when the agents asked about their chaperone, the young nun who had vanished with them, their reaction was chilling. Some began to cry. Others looked at the floor. One finally whispered, almost too softly to hear. She tried. Tried what? Tried to protect them? Tried to resist? No one would say more. Meanwhile, in a sterile interrogation room across the compound, the truck driver sat shackled to a steel table. His name was recorded as Raul Jimenez, a man in his 40s with a tired face, sweat-soaked shirt, and hands that trembled as he lit one cigarette after another. Agents pressed him. Where had he picked them up? Who was he delivering them to? How long had he been part of this operation? At first, he played dumb. He claimed he didn't know the girls were inside, that he was just a hauler, just a driver. But when agents slid the X-ray printouts across the table, the outlines of huddled figures staring back at him in ghostly black and white, his facade cracked. He dropped his head into his hands. They told me I had no choice, he muttered. If I didn't drive, I'd disappear too. Agents leaned forward. Who told you? Silence. He shook his head, eyes glassy with fear. But under steady questioning, pieces slipped out. He hadn't been the first driver. There had been others, many others. He didn't know how long the operation had run, only that his turn had come last month. He was given the truck, given instructions, given threats. When asked who gave the orders, he said only this: the men don't have faces. They never use names. Only the place. Always the place. The lead investigator frowned. What place? Jimenez hesitated, chain smoking until the ashtray overflowed. Finally, he whispered one word: Santa Lucia. The name meant nothing to the team in the room. Not yet, but when agents tried to press further, Jimenez clammed up entirely. He asked for a lawyer, then refused to speak another word. Hours later, he was transferred to federal custody. But the name lingered, hanging in the stale air of the interrogation room like smoke. Santa Lucia. Back in the medical tent, one of the girls stirred awake from a medicated sleep. Her voice was hoarse, but her words cut through the hush. We were never supposed to come back. And within days, the investigation would uncover something that proved she was right. Something written in the driver's abandoned notebook that tied the whole nightmare back to Arizona, to the very highway where the bus had first disappeared. The evidence locker in Nogales was crowded with items pulled from Raul Jimenez's truck. Food wrappers, a sweat-stained cap, a stack of falsified freight documents. None of it seemed promising, but it was a small, leather-bound notebook wedged beneath the driver's seat that changed everything. At first glance, it was ordinary. Pages of fuel calculations, lists of mileage, shorthand notes on repair costs. But as analysts flipped further in, the neat columns gave way to something else. Coded phrases, initials, and dates stretching back years. And one word, scrawled again and again, circled, underlined, as if it carried more weight than all the rest. Santa Lucia. Beneath it, sequences of numbers, geographic coordinates. Investigators huddled around a map, tracing the digits with trembling fingers. The coordinates pointed not south, not deep into Mexico as many had assumed, but north, back into Arizona, back toward the same stretch of desert highway where the Catholic girls' class had disappeared in 1995. The realization hit like a gut punch. For years, the narrative had been clear. The bus must have crossed the border, swallowed by cartel territory. But if the notebook was right, the operation had been anchored here, on U.S. soil, hidden in plain sight. The order was immediate. Mobilize. That night, black SUVs streaked down the I-19 undercover darkness, red and blue lights flashing silent against the sand-colored hills. Tactical teams fanned out into the desert, headlights cutting across scrubland and jagged rock. The coordinates led them to a cluster of abandoned ranch properties. Crumbling adobe walls and corrugated metal sheds left the elements. At first, there was nothing, just a groan of wind through broken windows, the crunch of boots over gravel. Then one agent noticed it, faint tire tracks, fresh, cutting through the dust. Another found a padlock shed with steel reinforcements that didn't match the weathered exterior. When the team pried it open, their flashlights illuminated a concrete chamber below, accessible by a hidden staircase. The air that wafted out was sour, chemical, heavy with decay. They descended. What they found inside was not a holding cell. Not anymore. The space was empty, stripped, scrubbed, but the walls told the story. Scratched into the concrete, overlapping in layers, were words in Spanish and English. Help. Mother. Forgive us. Dozens of fingernail carvings etched like a silent chorus of the forgotten. And in one corner, still nailed into the wall, a strip of plaid fabric, a school uniform. The agents froze. The girls had been here. Recently. But if this was the origin point, then the nightmare was far bigger than one truck, one driver. Who else had been moved through this hidden network? How many others had vanished, their faces never printed on missing posters? And then came the most chilling discovery. Behind a false panel in the concrete wall, one agent pulled out a box of photographs. Not recent ones, aged, faded, curled at the edges. Rows of school children, classes posed in uniforms, their faces smiling but their eyes unknowingly catalogued. Each photo had names written on the back. Each was stamped with the seal of different parochial schools across the Southwest, and several had red ink slashed across them. The pattern was undeniable. The Catholic girls' class of 1995 was not the only target. The team radioed it in. But as they did, one of the agents noticed something else. Headlights cresting the distant ridge, moving fast. A vehicle racing away from the site. Orders snapped across comms. Pursuit was authorized. Engines roared to life. The chase was on. And when they caught the fleeing vehicle, what was inside would make investigators realize they were not just chasing ghosts of the past. This network was alive, active, and still hunting children. Every clue leads closer to the truth. Subscribe now to follow the case as it unfolds. The desert night erupted in chaos. When the agent spotted headlights cresting the ridge beyond the ranch ruins, instinct took over. Engines roared to life. Tires clawing gravel. Sirens screaming against the empty sky. The fleeing vehicle, a dust-caked white panel van. barreled down a washboard road, headlights bouncing over uneven ground. Unit 6 intercept, the command snapped through radios. Do not lose that van. The convoy gave chase, black SUVs closing in, their beams cutting sharp through clouds of desert dust. Helicopter rotors thundered overhead, searchlights raking the ground. Inside the van, the driver swerved wildly, throwing up plumes of grit to blind his pursuers. He knew the terrain. He was gambling on narrow arroyos and half-forgotten cattle trails to shake federal pursuit. But the agents pressed harder, their engines screaming at the red line. Minutes stretched into a blur of grit and adrenaline. Every corner threatened to flip the van. Every blind rise could have ended it in a twisted roll of metal. And still, the driver pushed, desperate, reckless. Why risk so much unless what was inside was worth more than his own life? The answer came soon. As the van hurtled toward a dry creek bed, an SUV slammed broadside, clipping its rear bumper. The van fishtailed violently, tires losing grip. For an instant, it looked as though the driver might recover. Then momentum took over. The vehicle flipped. Metal shrieked. Glass shattered. The van rolled 3 times before slamming on its side, dust pluming into night air. Agents swarmed before the wreck had even settled, weapons drawn, flashlights searing the wreckage. The driver was pulled out first, bloody but alive, cursing in rapid Spanish, his eyes wide with terror. He wasn't afraid of arrest. He was afraid of something else, something behind him. Agents yanked open the rear doors. What they saw froze them in place. Inside the van was no ordinary cargo. For young girls, bound and gagged, huddled together against a steel wall, their faces streaked with dirt and fear. They were alive, barely conscious, eyes glazed as though drugged. The silence broke into shouts. Paramedics rushed forward, cutting restraints, checking pulses. The girls whimpered, clinging to whoever touched them, as though unsure this wasn't just another trick. But there was more. Stacked beside them were duffel bags. When opened, they revealed not weapons, not drugs, but files, paperwork, photographs, rosters, dozens of pages with the seals of Catholic schools across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, names of children neatly typed in rows, their birth years and grades listed with chilling precision, and some were marked, circled, underlined, targets. The investigators had stumbled into something far darker than a single trafficking ring. This was a machine, systematic, organized, schools mapped like hunting grounds, children reduced to checklists, and the rescued girls in the back of the van proved one brutal fact. It hadn't stopped in 1995. It was still happening. One agent, standing in the dust beside the wreckage, whispered a thought that now poisoned every mind at the scene. If we only found this van by accident, how many more are still out there driving right now? And when agents traced the documents inside those duffel bags, it would lead them to the heart of the operation, an unlikely figure hidden in plain sight, someone no one ever suspected. For years, the investigation had been chasing shadows, drivers, couriers, and half-truths passed between frightened girls who couldn't bring themselves to say everything at once. But after the vehicle pursuit in Texas, something new appeared. Inside the seized van, agents recovered not only the frightened teenagers, but also a slim black folder, water-stained but intact. Tucked within were documents that didn't belong in a smuggler's glove compartment. Church flyers, membership rosters, donation ledgers. And one name, printed and tidy, looping script across multiple pages, kept surfacing. The name belonged not to a stranger, but to someone local, familiar, respected. A man who had been photographed at community fundraisers, quoted in the diocesan newsletter, and who once shook hands with the mayor on the courthouse steps. He wasn't hiding. He was visible everywhere, so much so that no one had thought to look closer. The FBI had seen this pattern before, networks that used ordinary respectability as camouflage. A coach, a small town councilman, a youth group sponsor, someone who could blend seamlessly into the trust of parents and the obedience of children. When agents traced the Texas van's registration back, the paper trail snapped into place. The driver was a disposable figure, But the funding for the vehicle came from an Arizona nonprofit that styled itself as a charitable transport ministry. On paper, it collected donations for assisting disadvantaged children. In reality, it was a shell that financed a pipeline of missing girls from Arizona into hidden holding houses across the border. And at the top of its board, smiling from photographs and polished annual reports, sat the same man whose name agents now circled in red. He wasn't a shadowy trafficker in the margins. He was a deacon, a fundraiser, a familiar face who handed out hymnals every Sunday morning. When federal agents pulled his tax filings and matched them against border crossing dates, the coincidences evaporated. Each large donation coincided with the disappearance of young girls. Each vehicle purchased under his nonprofit's name aligned with a van later recovered in smuggling investigations. To the outside world, he was benevolence personified, a man who talked about service, sacrifice, and saving children. But in the eyes of investigators, he was now something else entirely. The orchestrator hiding in plain sight. The realization struck hard. This wasn't just a trafficking network operating in the shadows. It was a system propped up by someone who had convinced the community to trust him without question. The file on his desk was now the most dangerous evidence in the case. And for the first time, the FBI knew exactly where to look next. By the time agents had connected the nonprofit's records to the man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday, they knew there was no room for mistakes. One wrong move, and he would vanish into the same shadows he had used to hide dozens of girls before. Surveillance began quietly. Black SUVs parked 2 streets over from his stucco home in Mesa, Arizona. A pair of unmarked sedans rotated shifts outside the church where he greeted parishioners with a practiced smile. Inside FBI command posts, every detail was logged. What time he left for morning mass, how long he lingered at the rectory, which nights he drove alone to the desert outskirts under the cover of prayer meetings that never appeared on the parish calendar. Agents weren't just watching. They were listening. Microphones disguised as smoke detectors in his charity office. Long-range cameras hidden in parked delivery trucks. His voice, once booming through church halls, now played back in low whispers inside surveillance vans. And what they captured wasn't the voice of a benevolent leader. It was code. Half-finished sentences dropped over burner phones. Mentions of deliveries, our friends across, and the girls will be safe. Every phrase was cloaked in religious euphemism, as if salvation itself had been twisted into a smuggler's dialect. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night in November 2002. The deacon pulled his silver sedan into a remote storage lot, headlights cutting briefly across rows of locked units. He parked at the farthest edge, shut the engine, and waited. 15 minutes later, a white panel truck eased in behind him. From a distance, federal agents watched through thermoscopes as 2 figures approached, unloading a container small enough to fit inside the trunk. The handoff was fast, almost too fast. But when the deacon opened his wallet and passed an envelope thick with bills, the final link in the chain snapped into place. The order came down, sting in motion, teams converged. The storage lot lit up in flashing blue and red as agents closed in from every side. The truck's driver tried to reverse out, tires shrieking against asphalt, but was boxed in by armored SUVs. The deacon didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He stood there, expression calm, as if this had been rehearsed in his mind 100 times before. Inside the trunk of his sedan, agents found what they feared and what they prayed they wouldn't. 2 teenage girls disoriented, pale, and stuffed inside like cargo. The sting had worked. But the deacon's chilling composure, even as he was forced to his knees and cuffed beneath the flashing lights, left one burning question hanging over the case. If this was just one man, how deep did the network really go? And if he was only the face they had finally caught, who were the ones still waiting in the shadows? The arrest made headlines across Arizona within hours. Parishioners who had once shaken his hand at the church door now saw his photograph plastered on evening broadcasts, the deacon in chains. At first, many refused to believe it. How could a man who baptized their children and led Christmas food drives also be the architect of one of the state's darkest trafficking networks? But disbelief faltered as the evidence stacked higher. The courtroom became a stage. Federal prosecutors laid out documents pulled from his nonprofit's files. Donations that weren't donations, vehicles purchased with laundered cash, coded ledgers disguised as church expenses. They played recordings of his phone calls, where prayer meetings became delivery schedules, and the lost meant the missing. But the most harrowing testimony came not from experts or agents. It came from the girls, now young women. Some only 19 or 20. They took the stand and spoke in quiet, trembling voices about the night their class trip ended on that deserted Arizona highway, about the sudden detour, the locked vans, the false promises whispered to keep them silent, about how the deacon's presence loomed over every stage of their captivity, not always physically, but in the rules, the warnings, the punishments carried out in his name. Each testimony broke open the courtroom. Jurors sat in stunned silence. Parents wept in the gallery. The nation listened horrified, as 7 years of vanished lives were pieced together through fragmented memories and scars that would never fade. And then came the revelation that stunned even hardened investigators. The deacon had not been working alone. Beneath his role as a public face, financial trails revealed ties to a wider network, fragment of organized cells stretching into Mexico, Texas, and California. He was not the architect, but a bishop in a dark hierarchy that blurred the line between cult and commerce. In one chilling cross-examination, the prosecutor asked, "Were you helping these girls, as your sermons claimed, or were you selling them?" The deacon didn't answer. He simply smiled, a small, unnerving curve of the lips that froze the courtroom in place. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts. Sentencing was swift. Multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The gavel strike echoed through the chamber, but for many, it didn't feel like closure, because the truth was larger than one man. Even as the deacon was led away, shackles clinking against the courtroom floor, agents admitted privately that portions of the network remained in the wind. The ledgers hinted at other names, other cells, other deliveries unaccounted for. For the survivors, freedom came at a steep price. Their lives have been carved in two, the innocence of 1995 and everything after. Some returned to families who barely recognized them. Others slipped into anonymity, unable to face the public glare. The town itself never fully healed. Every classroom desk seemed to carry a ghost. Every church pew a shadow. And yet, there was resilience. In the years that followed, survivors formed advocacy groups, turning their trauma into a voice against the same networks that had stolen their childhoods. The image that once defined them, ghost-like silhouettes caught on an X-ray screen, was replaced with their own chosen stories of endurance, courage, and warning. But one lingering detail remained the most haunting. In the final search of the deacon's office, investigators discovered a single notebook with lists written in his tight, careful script. At the bottom of one page, beneath names that had been crossed out and dates that had long passed, there was a final line. It read, "The harvest never ends." The trial may have closed a chapter, but the echo of those words reminded everyone, jurors, agents, survivors, and the public, that what began in 1995 wasn't just a crime. It was a revelation of how evil can hide in plain sight, cloaked in trust, waiting for its chance to strike. And though justice was served, the question remained. If this was only one classroom, one deacon, one corner of a sprawling network, how many others were still missing?